Hello, thank you for joining us for advocates who are survivors. I'm Gabriella, NCCASA's Training and Communication Specialist. I will help monitor the chat box along with Deanna and let our ASL interpreters know when to switch. Thank you, Kathleen and Tina, for being our interpreters. I'm very excited to introduce our presenter, Aishah Shahidah Simmons, is, a, is our presenter for today. She is an award-winning Black feminist, lesbian cultural worker who, for over 25 years, has examined the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, and sexual violence. She is the producer, director of the Ford Foundation-funded, groundbreaking documentary film, No, the Rape Documentary, and the cutting-edge anthology, Love with Accountability, Digging Up the Roots of Child Sexual Abuse. Aishah's work is informed by her lived experiences as a child sexual abuse survivor, adult rape survivor, and Buddhist practitioner committed to disrupting and ending the inhumane humanely. Thank you, Aishah, for being here with us today.
Thank you, Gabriella. Thank you, NCCASA. It is wonderful to return, to share and learn and receive. So this is really wonderful. And just thank you to the ASL interpreters, Kathleen and Tina, for making this presentation more accessible. I'm really, really happy. So I just, in this complete spirit of transparency, I, like so many of us, am moving with a very, 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 very heavy heart, weary spirit. Just my emotions are all over the place based on all that is happening out in this country. And so I want to acknowledge that. And I think that when I first had conversations with Monica about this presentation, it was completely under the umbrella of talking about this in the context of COVID. And then, even when I had conversations with Gabriella in preparation, we weren't where we are now. And clearly the decimation of Black life has been going on for centuries. So I don't want to act like it's new, but the heightened and relentless awareness of it is just taking its toll. So I just want to begin acknowledging that. So with that said, I think that just kind of moves into my next slide, which is around creation of sacred space during these next 90 minutes. Hopefully we have sacred spaces beyond these next 90 minutes, but I think that it's really important that we all commit to having co-creating sacred space. These are really hard times for all of us, impacting us in parallel ways and in completely different ways. And in creating that sacred space, it is for me always, always, always important to acknowledge where we are, literally and figuratively, but where we are seated, standing, perhaps laying down, if we're anywhere in the Americas, that we remember that this whole hemisphere, from Alaska all the way down to Argentina, all of the Americas and the Caribbean, is founded on white supremacist genocide of indigenous nations, theft of indigenous land, theft of Africans, human trafficking. When we talk about human trafficking contemporarily, I include myself in the we. I don't think about enslavement of African peoples and bodies. I never thought about that until recently, actually. And credit Dr. Shantae Smalls for for sharing that in a Dharma talk that she gave, that, you know, those of us who are African descendant, we are descendants of enslavement, of human trafficking, that this is part of this, of all that is happening in these moments. There's forced migration, rape of Indigenous and African children, women, gender non-binary people, and men. So I think that it's really important that we think about that. And this is one slide only focusing on Turtle Island, which is now known as as North America, because Canada is up here. I'm pointing to my screen, but I realize I need to use the thing. And these are, I don't like the word tribes. It's not my slide. But this is the names of the indigenous nations that inhabited this land for centuries before most of us or most of our ancestors arrived here. And so I think it's important that we acknowledge that, and acknowledge that we are on land that was taken and not given, unless and so that is really important. And I just encourage all of us to think about where we are located, and if you don't know today in this moment, that you take the time to look at and find the names of the original peoples who inhabited this land and inhabited the city, the state, the area where you're located. I'm presently located on the ancestral lands of the Anacostan people, which neighbors the Piscataway and Pamunkey peoples, and known as Washington, D.C. I've just learned this because I used to live on the land of the Lenape in Philadelphia, and recently moved to DC. So it's Philly and DC. I mean, so many places are hotbeds, so many places, but just watching news last night and all the time and this morning, they're just very much hotbeds. So I want to encourage us to take a moment and have libation. And libation is usually pouring of water. When I speak a lot, I always talk about pouring, instead of pouring water on the ground or in the dirt on the earth, that I pour words on the screen. But it's an offering. And so I wanted to use the images here of a candle, as well as an image of a body of water. And the body of water that you're looking at on the right-hand side of your screen, if you have sight, is the body known as the Combahee River. And it's a very important river for all of, I was about to say African American history, but for U.S. history. It is where the great warrior Harriet Tubman led military battle that resulted in the freeing of over 700 slaves. It is the only battle at that time period, and maybe to date, I'm not sure because I'm not versed on military history, that was led and executed by a woman, by a former enslaved woman, Harriet Tubman. So I just felt like it was important to have that body of water. And I'm sure that the word Combahee is indigenous, I'm sure, but not able to at this moment share the origins of that word. So many of our words, languages like Manhattan, there was the Manhattan Project, Illinois, so many words, provinces, languages are part of indigenous folks, but it's not even a part of our awareness now. And so that it's really important. And yesterday is June 1st was the anniversary of that action that General Tubman, as many called her, Sister Harriet Tubman, led. So I just want to take a moment for us to just focus on our breath. And if breathing is difficult, and it's, it's such it can be a trigger, particularly in these moments, but even if, for respiratory issues, if focusing on your breath is too much, then focus on piece of clothing on your body, like touching it, just a sensation. It's just take a moment, and just in honor of libation, and recognizing that the fact that Indigenous and Black people and other marginalized people are still breathing, the ones who are, because many are no longer, is really cause for celebration. So in the midst of so much turmoil and pain, that we have to, I believe, celebrate the resilient spirit, which is a form of resistance. And Toni K. Bambara, who's a writer, who's now an ancestor, she says, and I quote, "We've rarely been equipped and encouraged to appreciate the fact that the truth works and it releases the spirit, and that it is a joyous thing. We live in a part of the world that equates social responsibility with naive idealism, that defines the unrelenting pursuit of knowledge and wisdom as fanaticism." And Toni wrote that in 1983, and it's like past its prologue right now. So I'm just going to take a moment of silence. Thank you. And well, I'll talk more about silence and meditation later in my presentation. Gabriella shared my bio, and I just wanted to just give a little bit of visual and context for who I am and how I come to this work, because I think it is important. So as she shared, that I am a Black feminist lesbian, culture worker, filmmaker, writer, and I have been working in this to end sexual violence for over 2 decades. And for me, this work is not only it's not theoretical, or not only theoretical, but it is embodied practice. It is part of a continuum. When I first started working in the field of sexual violence, and in the field, let me be very clear, I've never worked as an advocate in the sense of at an organization. I'm not a counselor or therapist. So I come to this work as a culture worker, as a survivor culture worker. So for me, my work is documenting and amplifying the work, the testimonies of survivor advocates, and the work of scholars and activists and healers, specifically in diasporic Black communities, the work that we're all doing to eradicate sexual violence. So, for me, I see it as in partnership and in tandem to create resources that can be used, that many have used. So I want to just be really clear, because I think that being an advocate on the front lines, working directly day to day with survivors is at a whole nother, and I do say higher level, and not in terms of to get into a hierarchy, but that's real. And for me, it's important to talk about work on a continuum, because over the years, I have really come to learn for me, my belief is that we're not going to end the epidemic with policing and prisons. And when I started this work in 1994, my whole thing was like, we got to lock up the bad guys, so to speak. And guys was very intentional when I was using that language, because for me, sexual violence was something that cisgender men committed against cisgender women and girls. but you know, life and all of the, and just education and you know, just community. It's told me that there is no sexual violence happens to all humans, and it is can be committed by all humans. There's definitely statistics show where there are higher numbers and all that, but it's just to be clear that this is a pandemic. So for me, my first cultural work was Know the Rape documentary, and it is available now for $1 online on Vimeo. And that was really, I started it during Sexual Assault Awareness Month and just decided to keep it that way for the time being, because we're all struggling economically. Many of us, I should say, are struggling economically. And my hope is that it will be a resource that people can use. It is available in English, open captions with English, Spanish, French, Portuguese, and German, subtitles. And it's really looking at the atrocity pandemic of sexual violence in Black communities, focusing definitely on Black cisgender Black men sexually assaulting cisgender Black women and girls, and really thinking about how we can end that pandemic without relying on criminal justice. The next project is my anthology, Love with Accountability. And on June 11th, there will be a webinar talking about that more in depth, and really excited that two members, the Monica Johnson Hostler and Tracy Wright of NCCASA, the executive director, and I can't remember Tracy's title at this moment. They are contributors to the anthology and will be also part of the conversation. But this is an anthology that features the voices of 40 diasporic survivors and advocates who are cis, male, female, gender non-binary, and trans, who are working to not only end child sexual abuse, but really envisioning how we can end it without relying on the criminal justice system. And yesterday received news that it received the 2020 Lambda Literary Award for Best LGBTQ Anthology. So just such a great honor in a time such as this, which then leads me in terms of to the issue at hand about for advocates who are survivors. But I just wanted to share some of the work that I've done to lay a foundation for what I would like to share. And I want to be clear, because while I feel like I know a lot, I don't know it all. And there's so much that I'm continuously learning. So I definitely am looking forward to, after my formal presentation, to engaging in conversation, because I do believe that knowledge and information is really best when it happens in community. And so I think that that's really important. So you need to pause.
We're going to switch our interpreters now.
Sorry, thank you.
To everybody that is attending, here, let me do this first. Okay, to everyone who is attending, this is the first time that we used interpreters. Tina, you should be visible now. So right now, Tina and our presentation should be visible. If it's not, please let me know. And Aisha, you can go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. And okay, so pandemic within a pandemic. So all of us on this webinar, I'm assuming based on the topic of the webinar, we already know that the pandemic.
Aisha, can you pause? They're saying that they don't see Tina.
Okay. Did you pin her? Pin them.
Yes. All right, can we see her now? Okay, great. Thank you so much, audience.
Great. And I'm so glad You said use a pronoun, Gabriella, because I did not say my pronouns, which are she and her. So excuse me for that oversight. Most of us on this webinar, I believe, know that there is a pandemic of child sexual abuse, child rape, teen and domestic violence, teen and adult domestic violence, and adult rape, that we already know that. So long before COVID, there was an often unseen and unacknowledged weight that all survivor advocates on the front lines hold in response to sexual violence. So COVID-19 only serves to exacerbate the pandemic of sexual violence and the weight that survivor advocates are holding. And what I mean by that, and I believe, is that, you know, I'm very glad that there's been a lot of information out in the world around the response to COVID and how we should take care of ourselves and protect ourselves and all of that. And simultaneously, it's been challenging, because I was just like, wow, like, what is it going to take for the world, but we're here in the US, but for the world to see that we've got a serious pandemic that that is not also taking and capturing the attention in the way in which the global health pandemic is, and that's sexual violence, all forms of it. And there's a way in which, particularly in terms of the important lifting up of essential workers, specifically the healthcare workers, but all those who make those of us who are able to shelter in place, because so many are not, and we're able to shelter in place because there's so many people out in the world working, right? And recognizing that and lifting up those essential workers. What I haven't seen as much is really acknowledgement of the survivor advocates, or the advocates, right? Regardless of if they're survivors or not, the advocates, and what you all are doing day in, day out, on call all of the time, anytime, long before COVID. And now it's exasperated and intensified because, you know, violence, all forms of violence is just increased as a result of many of us sheltering at home. So there's also, in this moment, a very specific reality for Black survivor advocates. They're holding a quadruple weight in these current heightened moments of white supremacy decimating Black life. And I want to be clear that these are not easy times for any of us. Like, so I don't want to act like it, you know, they're just not. But I lift and center Black survivor advocates in this moment, because as we know, most sexual violence happens intracommunally. And I apologize, there's construction happening in the room next door to me beyond my control. I apologize. So I just want to say that, because you probably will be hearing some noise. Anyway, and so, and understanding that sexual violence happens intracommunally, how can Black survivor advocates hold multiple, and at times what may appear to be conflicting positions around protection of Black lives and accountability for sexual violence? Black survivor advocates are emotionally, psychologically, and perhaps those who may be outside protesting and participating in the uprisings are physically confronting white supremacy against our communities while addressing sexual violence in our communities, right? And so, and this comes back for me about why I am really in firm belief that policing in prisons in response to sexual violence cannot work. And because first of all, I just don't believe in it. Let me be very clear. I don't believe that is the way to respond to monstrous acts. I don't think that then we behave monstrously in response to monstrous acts. But then when we think about it in a Black context, it is very challenging when we have just been privy to a slew recently, right, in just the past 2-3 months of murders by the police and self-appointed white vigilantes. So then recognizing that, who's going to call the police if they've been sexually abused and they are Black in the community? And how do you provide support for someone in these moments, a Black, how do you as a Black survivor provide support for other Black survivors in these moments? So these are things that I know without knowing for a fact that many are holding. I know what I'm holding, and I'm not an advocate on the front lines talking to survivors, but these are things that I think that really have to be lifted and considered, particularly in organizational frameworks where maybe there are not a lot of Black advocates on staff, or maybe there's only one or whatever, but what are we asking of the survivor advocates who are on the front lines in this anti-sexual violence work, in the supporting survivors of sexual violence work? What are the mechanisms that are in place to support them? This is really critical work. And this comes from me in terms of self-care. I love this quote by Audre Lorde, who was a Black feminist, lesbian, warrior poet, when she wrote, "I've come to believe that caring for myself is not self-indulgent. Caring for myself is an act of survival." And it's a very, I think it is a very important quote. I think it is specifically, it's an important quote for all survivor advocates, but definitely for BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color survivors, where we are working round the clock. I mean, there's that. And then when I say that we're working around the clock, because we're dealing with racial trauma while we're also dealing with sexual trauma, and those of us who are advocates are doing our best to provide, and I'm using our, but I don't mean me, Aishah, our, but to provide support to those who are calling the hotlines and who need support. And then even those I know, in terms of when you may be recognized in your community, in your family, as someone who does this work. So then people who may not want to use the traditional routes to receiving support will call on you anyway, right? And so what does that mean for us to care for ourselves, right? Care for ourselves in a world in which, another quote from Audre Lorde, we were never meant to survive, right? What does it mean to care for ourselves when the siege is relentless? How do we give ourselves permission, right? How do we give ourselves permission to rest? How do we do that? And this is where organizational culture comes into place. What are the mechanisms in place that support that? I firmly believe that our work cannot be, what is the word that I want to use? That we can't live without our lives, and also that our work can't be healthier than we are. So if we're not healthy, then how can the work be healthy? And so I think that these are the questions, and particularly in crises moment, as well as in a moment where, work and productivity is rewarded in terms of funding, how many survivors have we supported, all of that. What does that mean in these moments of a global health pandemic, right? We're not out of it. And then I fear what could happen after, what are the numbers going to look like in the wake of all of these uprisings and protests. I'm so worried, not worried to a point that I don't think that people should uprise and protest. I'm just worried about what's happening there. And so that the numbers are going to increase. And then the conversations that we don't even know is what is happening behind the lines in terms of the sexual violence that we're not even hearing about necessarily, that we're not even able to really talk about. What does it mean in these moments, right, where it is imperative that we talk about dismantling and ending white supremacy? It is imperative, without question. And it is imperative that we talk about ending sexual violence. And how do we hold all of these spaces while we're supporting the survivors, while we're dealing with our own residual trauma? That is really, really important. And I use this slide where it says healing is a journey and not a destination, because many of us as as survivor advocates, we may be, and hopefully are, further along than that person who is just been either assaulted or just come to awareness about their assault, or is having a PTSD flashback, a trigger, and not having the resources in terms of how to cope during when this arises. Hopefully we are a little further along, that we can hold that space with them while keeping ourselves grounded and not getting triggered. And then if we do get triggered, have the resources in response to that. And so for me, I always remind myself that healing from child and adult sexual violence is multi-layered, it's delicate, it's relentless, it's patient, compassionate, self-loving, transformational, and ongoing work. And I think as advocates, it reminds me of kind of as like, because advocates are, I believe advocates are healers, not necessarily healers in the way in which, yeah, they're healers. I believe that. And also educators in many ways. And when we're in those kind of positions, then it almost, it creates an environment where we're not able to be vulnerable. And I know, unlike the history of so many of rape crisis centers where everybody was out about, I mean, in fact, it was survivors who founded this movement. And so, and it was survivors who didn't necessarily have clinical degrees and all that, but who were working and supporting other survivors. I understand I understand that is not necessarily the case now in terms of where people are outing themselves about their survivor status when they're working with clients. I'm not advocating for that at all. What I am saying, however, is that as a result of that, as a result of the often kind of wall between advocate and survivor, that then there isn't, where are the places for the survivor advocate to get that support, to find rest, to be triggered, to be like, I can't take this another day. I need a break. What are, and when they cannot, if you're in a work environment where that's not possible, or your commitment is such that you just can't see a way to come out of it, what are things that you can do? And that's what I want to talk about in these next couple of slides. But I cannot underscore how important it is that we take care of ourselves and that we acknowledge that this is a lot. It was a lot long before 2020 and these moments that we're in, but it is so multi-layered. It is so multi-layered. And I haven't even, I talked about Black, and I want to be clear about Black is not a this overarching it's not just one kind of identity that comes under Black. That Black is deaf, Black is disabled, Black is LGBTQ, and so that there are all these multiple identities, not only in terms that falls under Black, that there's not just this kind of like straight heterosexual model, and that's for all of us, right? So that all of us are coming from embodying different identities and realities. And so many of us, whether we're Black or not, are being impacted directly or indirectly by all that's happening. And then we're being called upon to support those who are in immediate crises. I mean, this is Herculean work. I wish I had a masculine frame of reference, but that's just what came to mind. It's Herculean work, and it's really critical that we acknowledge that. I lift this book, The Body Keeps the Score, which isn't necessarily for me it's a critical read, but it is not kind of I mean, he does touch upon difference in terms of gender and culture and sexuality, but it's not, he doesn't do a deep dive. I lift this book because it really underscores how our bodies remember. Our bodies remember the trauma, so that and it is very, and regardless of if it was today or 50 years ago or 40, in my instance 40 years ago, where it starts, that it is a part of the fabric of our being. Like how I started out this talk talking about the origins of this country, right? So that it's there. And so for us to not recognize it and not acknowledge it, at least to ourselves, if no one else, I mean, hopefully people are able to receive support, therapeutic support, that it's almost impossible to not get triggered, even, you know, doing this work for a long time. And so, and to remember that, and to have compassion for yourself, when things when that arises. And that's, again, in terms of that's why I thought it was really powerful in terms of talking about survivor and advocates, like holding multiple identities. Audre Lorde and many others, but talked about, you know, how so we're holding multiple identities embodied into one, so we can be an expert in this one moment, and also be vulnerable. And that vulnerability is a part of our expertise. I believe that it can inform how we move and engage with the people who are needing help. How are we, Gabriella, for time, in terms of, do we need to switch, or is everything okay? Tina?
We have about 2 more minutes before we switch.
Okay.
But we do have a question, so that was great timing, Aisha.
Okay. All right.
The question is, do you truly believe we can solve sexual abuse trauma without law enforcement or those who advocate with them?
Yes, I do. I don't think so. Yes, I do believe that we can eradicate child sexual abuse without law enforcement. Now, and I believe that it will require a lot of work to do that work. And I think that it is really, and I think that I believe it is imperative that we are invested in doing that work. It requires work in relying on communities and community accountability. And I think that what we can see that's happening now, I mean, I don't want to call a police officer if somebody steals everything in my home. So let alone in terms of sexual violence. I don't, Aishah Shahidah Simmons does not trust the police. I don't, as a Black woman, as a Black lesbian woman, I am very fearful of them. And my body was violated as a child and as a young woman, and the trauma is ongoing, that lasting imprint. I mean, I'm not where I was 40 years ago when it started, but I'm still on my healing journey. And with that, now one of my harm doers is an ancestor. And even with that, I would not have wanted my grandfather, who molested me when I was a child for 2 years, to have gone to jail. What I wanted was for him to stop. What I wanted was for my parents to intervene, which they did not at the time. And so I think that we have to recognize that we are all capable of causing harm. We all, and now there's a harm spectrum. I want to be very clear. Murder, sexual assault to, gossiping. It's a harm spectrum. But I think that when we recognize that, and when we start looking at the acts, and not just kind of like, oh, he or she or they are monsters, rather than they have committed monstrous acts and they need to be held accountable. That I think that is really critical. And I think that if we only focus on that person who has committed the act, we're leaving a lot of people involved out of the equation. I use myself as an example in terms of, I was abused as a child by my grandfather. I told, nothing happened. So yes, what my grandfather did was horrible. Unforgivable. I don't want to say unforgivable for me. For others, it may be, but it was horrific. But my parents were bystanders and didn't do anything. So my question is, what what are we going to do with all of the people involved in allowing the sexual violence, the domestic violence occurring? It's very rare that someone is just committing harm just in the absence of harm, and without other systems in place that support that. So just this notion of like, if we arrest this rapist or this batterer, that therefore the person, we're all going to be safe. No. Now, I do think we have to isolate people, or make sure it has to be survivor centered. I want to make sure that the immediate survivor centered, because so often the person who's caused harm has been harmed. But we have to figure out ways, and when I say we have to figure out, there are organizations, the Bay Area Transformative Justice Coalition, where they have developed have developed programming and documentation around pods, forming community accountability. And then because many of us are not connected. I mean, you may know your neighbor, but if you're being abused in your home, are you going to go next door to tell your neighbor? This requires a lot of work. There's something called the Transformative Justice Hub, which has a lot of resources. I think, and then I'm on the fence around, because there is a very deep discussion around the difference between restorative justice in terms of restoring or reform with criminal justice versus transforming the whole entire paradigm. But I think that given what we see, what we've just recently witnessed, not let alone if we just did the roll call, I think that it is, unless you are a white cis person, I think it is a huge ask. And I know that there are a lot of Black people who call the police, and there are a lot of Black people who are police. I'm not saying that, but in this moment, it is a huge ask for somebody who's being raped right now. Who feels comfortable and safe to call the police? There's a collective Survived and Punished, whose work is supporting so many predominantly BIPOC, but not only BIPOC. There are low-income white women and people in prison for defending themselves against their harm doers. So, and their harm doers are still out in the street. So a lot of times when law enforcement are involved on, that particularly when people are from marginalized communities, the person who's seeking help gets harmed again by the state. So I think that, there's like the short-term plan, and then there's the long-term generational plan. But I don't think that it's working, because if law enforcement and prisons and all that work, why do we still have rape? And people are being raped in prison, and not only raped by incarcerated people, being raped by correctional officers. It's like 40-50% of correctional officers are raping in prison, children, adults. So it's hard. I want to be very clear. It's for me, it's hard. And I've been robbed with a gun like this at my head, and I called the police. This was 1990. Gun like this, and right at my head. Going to a club with friends when I was 21. Still remember it. And at that time, I definitely called the police. I'm not even going to be some kind of revisionist. So it is hard. It's very hard. And to think about what does safety look like without police. But I think these current moments have shown me, they continuously show me, it's not a new awakening. It's shown me that I'm not safe with the police.
Hey, Aisha, we are going to go ahead and switch interpreters. Thank you, Tina.
Have we switched, or?
Give me a second.
Okay.
I think the problem is I wasn't spotlighting the video before. Folks, this is just a gentle reminder of what Aisha said at the beginning when it comes to the intention and the grounding of this webinar. And so going forward, we will stick with that. Thank you.
thinking about ways, and I want to just kind of finish this. Not that doesn't mean there can't be questions, but I think there's like a couple more slides, and then I really do want to open up for conversation, and I want to be clear about something before I talk about meditation. I think it is really important that we have the difficult conversations. I am not interested in, I don't want to be shut down, and I'm not interested in shutting someone down, right? So if somebody's like, look, I believe in the police, and I say, I don't believe in the police, I think that my affirmation is that all of us in this webinar are interested in the eradication of violence. Hopefully all forms of violence. I mean, we're talking about sexual violence, but I believe that all forms of violence are interconnected, that white supremacy, sexual violence, patriarchy, classism, homophobia, transphobia, autism, which is for hearing people who do not know what autism is discrimination against deaf people, which is why I'm so glad that we have ASL interpreters here. Disability justice, immigration justice. So so all of these things are intertwined, and all of us have lived experiences and that inform how we move forward. And I think what's really important is that we have safe spaces where we can talk about these realities. In my anthology, there are three contributors who, in response to the sexual violence that they experienced, one of whom was raped by the police, they sought legal action. And in each of their cases, they were successful. Justice was served, and I'm using that in quotations, but justice was served in that the person who raped them was sent to jail. And it's quite remarkable because one of the people, one of the contributors who pressed charges against the police officer who raped her is a trans woman, and the other two were black cis women. And I say it's remarkable because so often Black women of any gender, trans or cis, there's no justice in terms of it as we define it in the criminal justice system. And I thought that even though this anthology, Love with Accountability, hones in on how can we end child sexual abuse without the involvement of the state or the police, I thought it was imperative to include these offerings from these three contributors, because I'm not interested in solely talking with the choir. I want us, and each of them are very much struggle and are not in favor of using the criminal justice system. And again, we're talking about child sexual abuse, so this is kind of in hindsight in terms of people's sharings, but they did talk about why criminal justice was used. I share all of that to say that I think we will never get ahead of we will never be able to even get to the point of co-creating a world without violence if we don't have the difficult conversations. So in terms of my previous comments, before we took a break to change interpreters, that's how I feel very strongly about it. And I also understand that others don't, feel strongly no, we have to use law enforcement. So I just want to say that in terms of the co-creation of sacred space is not, there's only one way, it's my way or the highway. I'm not coming from that. I think that it is really important to discuss and think about that. So with that shared, I and as Gabriella shared in my bio, I am I'm a Buddhist. Mindfulness is not Buddhist. It's secular, but I am a Buddhist. And for me, how I have dealt with, been able to cope with holding a lot of trauma in terms of, 40 contributors writing about their trauma. They're about, 30 or so in Know the Rape documentary and editing and all of that, let alone the work that I do screening and talking about the work that I receive a lot of folks who share about their trauma with me all of the time, emails, texts, sometimes when I'm least expecting it. So I've had to figure out how do I, as a survivor on my healing journey, and yet as a cultural worker and activist committed to the eradication of all forms of violence, and my lens of eradicating all forms of violence is through sexual violence. Other people, it's through racial violence, has been meditation. And meditation has and right now in these moments has a lot of connotations and all that. And as I said, for me, it's my spiritual practice, but it doesn't have to be a spiritual practice. What I think is really important is that we pause, that we connect with ourselves. And I think that is so critical, particularly when dealing with any form of trauma, especially sexual trauma, that so many survivors, not survivor advocates, and then, disassociate as a part of surviving, right? They're not connected, because sometimes to connect to the self is to connect to the trauma, because our bodies are the site of trauma. I was thinking yesterday when I was watching George Floyd's brother go to the site of trauma, like I got triggered watching it, triggered thinking about his life, a life, murdered. But then thinking about, like, oh my God, like we are, as the film I Am Evidence, we are the evidence, we are the site of trauma. It's not like I'm going to go over there to put flowers. We are the site. And so it is so important that we reclaim that site. We see that a lot in terms of where there's murders that happen, that, people reclaim it and, and put flowers or water, that we have to do that with our bodies. And so for me, I see meditation as one, not the only way to do that, to reclaim that and to reclaim it and say, no, that this is sacred space. It was violated against our will, but I am reclaiming it. And for me, that is what mindfulness represents for me, really a reclamation of the body, of sacred space within. And I believe in like hour-long sits of meditation, but I really want to say that even just a few moments, particularly if you're like back to back with clients or responding and on the hotline, just to really ground yourself. And as I started out with breath, but it doesn't have to be breath. It can be touch, it can be color. There's one exercise where you just kind of look around the room and you name what you're seeing, just to kind of bring you back after particularly hearing a harrowing story, testimony, supporting someone that may ignite your own, or even if it doesn't, just to kind of ground you. And then once you identify, there's a book, there's a yoga mat, there's a printer. And once you identify that, then that kind of brings you back into the space where you are. And then you take a moment or 2 or 3, if you can give yourself 5 minutes or 10 minutes to just breathe, or touch yourself, just to rub your arms, just to make contact with yourself. If focusing on breath is triggering, a lot of times you'll hear people say, close your eyes. Closing eyes can be triggering because you have to know what's happening at all, at times, or you just don't necessarily feel safe, or you may not even be in a safe space. You may be in a car, in a traffic or whatever, you know what I'm saying? So, you don't have to, it's not necessarily about zoning out. It is about tuning in and being present with yourself in as long as you can, and definitely one of the things that I think, particularly engaging virtually, I've learned that in terms of just seeing the images, sometimes seeing comments that I'm like, what are they talking about? And just it's like, wait, go in before you respond. Do you need to respond? But just really tapping in. And so for me, I close my eyes and I focus on my breath. I focus on the sensation right under my nose, above my upper lip. That is that just focusing on that with my eyes closed. That's what I do. Others focus on breath through the stomach. That they find that it's easier to focus, to connect, because they can feel the stomach going in and out. Breath may not work if you have asthma. I think in this current moment of what happened to George Floyd is just too triggering. Like I said, just tapping, just making contact with yourself, but really just around, like, as I said before, to connect within, to really just connect to your source and to reclaim it, to reclaim in your, the body, as well as, I mean, I believe in, reclaiming the mind as well. A lot of times we talk about, you hear talk about psychological and emotional support, and that is critical. But as I, started out with showing the image of the book, The Body Keeps the Score, that just to remember that trauma is in our bodies. And for some of us, many of us, it's intergenerational. So it's in our DNA. And so it is important to take time as often as we can to connect and reclaim the space. And so, well, that's my contact information, which, but I want to now, how are we with your time? I'd like to use this time to engage in conversation, and I'll leave the context screen up for a minute and then I'll take it down, but and just come back to a full screen. But I just would like to engage in hear from, there's that ableist language, receive responses or questions, and engage. As I said, I know a lot of things that are informed by my life, but this call is for survivor advocates. Many of you know a lot of things, and just to really engage. As I start out in terms of how do we transform? How do we all work ourselves out of jobs, right? Where, I mean, I'm 51. I can't see it happening in my lifetime, and maybe I need to, but I want to envision a world where we're not raping and abusing and battering or murdering people. I really do. And for me, I think the danger in these kind of immediate responses, I mean, we have to have immediate responses. I think the danger into kind of immediate solutions, it's not responses, is that we often will think that then jail becomes the answer, right? Because it's not easy. It's not easy in court systems, and people have to wait forever and all of that. I want to be clear, it's not easy, but it is a lot harder to think about what does accountability look like without any absence of prisons, and not only with the person who's caused the harm, but also the all of the bystanders. And most importantly, as it pertains to this conversation, what does it mean for survivors doing this work in service of other survivors? How can you continue to take care of yourselves in these moments? And that's why I really point to mindfulness as one way. People, there's all, and really, let me also be clear, as an African American who practices Buddhism, which comes out of India. I know a lot of people do yoga. I think it's really also important that we don't participate in appropriation without giving credit, without acknowledging, without understanding, for instance, that yoga wasn't just about getting in shape, that yoga was really about preparing the body for prayer, meditation. I'm not saying that one has to do that, but just to really acknowledge the origins. This is why I started out by, in terms of acknowledging the origins of this land, that we're in this country we're so diverse. And so we have access to an unlimited supply of information by so many different cultures. And when we're not of that culture, and that's why I started by talking about Buddhism coming out of India, I believe that we have a responsibility to acknowledge the culture, acknowledge the origins. That doesn't mean don't do it, don't practice it, don't, but to really acknowledge it. And if it's shifting, to acknowledge that as well. That that in our quest to be well, in our quest to heal ourselves, that we do not replicate or cause harm, right? By appropriation. So I just think that that's really important. So I'd like to hear from some of you. There's that word "here" again, but
We have 3 questions, so I will start with the first one. How do we educate ourselves on how sexual violence is taking place in the lives of politicians? How can or should our advocacy of sexual abuse affect our political views?
yeah. I think that this is, it's not a hard question. I'm trying to think about how to answer this diplomatically. I think it is really critical that we acknowledge that sexual violence is pervasive, that it is a pandemic, that there isn't any group of people like, oh, well, they don't do it. No, not everybody does it, but every group of people, however we define it, not just racially, but entertainers, politicians, etc., that there are harm doers in our midst. The tragedy, the horror is that, and I think that this plays into, I think going back to talking around what justice looks like, is that we have created, when I say we, I'm not necessarily mean we, but what's been created is this monster good person, right? Versus monstrous acts. And so as a result of that, right, rapists are bad. Rapists need to go to jail or burn in hell, or, that as a result of that, then our person, whoever our person is, and I'm not going to name them, our person can't be a rapist because rapists are bad. They need to go to jail and burn in hell, right? But our person who we don't like, they can be a rapist because they're horrible persons anyway. And so I think that we have to, and I don't think it's going to happen before November 2020, but we've got to begin to do that work around dealing with all of the complexities and contradictions and talking about what does accountability look like in these moments. Okay. I think that, and to act as if, when a politician that we may like, may feel like have to support or whatever, for whatever reasons, right? That to therefore then kind of create a narrative that the person who says, who accuses the person of assaulting them, to then demonize them, to throw them to the wolves, right? All because we need this person, I think is very dangerous. And I think particularly those of us who do this work, who do anti-sexual violence work. It's not funny, but I said everybody has a rapist that they like, everybody. And they may not know that they're a rapist. Let me be very clear. It's not like they're saying, oh, I like this rapist or whatever. But then what happens is that when they find out that the person has raped or sexually harmed someone, then somehow we start, trying to fit ourselves in some sort of fit that person or contextualize or blame. And I think that, it is imperative for those of us in the sexual violence movement to resist that narrative. And even if it means the person that we believe we have to support or whatever, that we then to acknowledge that I believe that this person has caused harm. I believe that this person needs to be held accountable. And I'm going to vote for this person because I don't feel like there's anything else. The other alternative is not acceptable. It's not okay because of a political party or a political stance that someone takes, to be ready to like roar and be enraged around their alleged acts or confirmed acts of sexual violence, and not to be around all. So if we're about eradicating all forms of sexual violence, then we have to talk about all of it. And I think that we also have to talk about, what does accountability look like? What does justice look like for survivors? And when a lot of times we talk about survivor-led, I have used that language, and I on the one hand wholeheartedly believe it, and then I also know that there are a lot of harm doers who are also survivors. So what does that mean? You know, what does that work look like? Like, are we just saying survivor-led, or are we talking about survivor-led survivors who have intersectional analysis around all of the oppressions that exist and are really working on centering all, and as opposed to some? Are we talking about survivors who refuse to talk about the complexities when political candidates have been accused of sexual violence, that they just out and ignore it? I think that that's not okay. It's definitely not okay.
Sorry to interrupt. We are going to go ahead and switch out interpreters. Is everyone able to see? Yes. Okay, great.
Let's stop the screen share. That might be easier.
Okay, you can go ahead if you want to finish that question, or we could continue to the next one.
Yeah, I'll just finish by saying I think that we have to be committed to talking about the complexities. And I think the best way to do it is to, I think one way is to talk about right, you know, in thinking about the two-party system. And I'm not just talking about the current person in the White House and the other person's secret candidate. I'm not just talking about Trump. Why am I acting ridiculous? I'm not just talking about Trump and Biden, but I'm thinking across boards. I think that it would be, I think what could make the conversations easier, if there's such a word, is to really talk about political candidates on both sides of the aisle who've been accused of causing harm, of raping, sexually assaulting, I use harm, but, you know, who's been accused of that, and talking about responses, and really beginning to interrogate, well, why do we respond this way with this candidate, and why do we respond this way with that person? And really thinking about it in terms of sexual violence, and centering that, and then also then talking about bigger pictures. But I think just naming like, I'm supporting this person, and despite the fact that there are all these questions, rather than blaming survivors for coming forward.
So our next question is, how should we start being an advocate? How should we share our stories on our platform to reach others? What should we say or shouldn't say?
Yeah, in terms of, you know, it's very complicated. I have really struggled with how we see so many images of just horrific acts of racist violence. And I don't really see a lot of trigger warnings, not at the rate that I see trigger warnings around sexual violence. And I struggle with that, because I feel like when survivors share about the violence that we've experienced, that there's a way in which we are encouraged to either not talk about the actual acts because we're triggering people, which I understand. But again, I feel like how many times has so many videos of Black death been circulated? And it's not an either or. It's really around how do we make ourselves known to others? One of the things that I've experienced with my film No is that there's so many different survivor stories, and that there were people in screening audiences who said, prior to seeing your film, I didn't know that what happened to me was rape, right? Because someone said yes to one form of activity and not to another form, or they said yes before but not tonight, and they didn't know. And I share that to say that I really, I think it's really important for survivors to let others know that they are in the midst, so to speak. And I do believe in content warning or trigger warning out of respect of not, triggering anyone who is in a very raw space. But I think it is important to let others know, because what happens is when they know that you are in the room, virtual, any room, then they may reach out to you to ask for resources. They may reach out to you to share. I think that it's also important that more and more of us who are able, that we're out around the violence that we've experienced, because I think even though sexual violence is everywhere, it's not discussed in the ways, and it's just not discussed in the ways. I mean, yes, the Me Too movement created an unprecedented opportunity for an awareness around sexual violence, but it's still not talked about. There's still so much shame centered around it, and so I think that the opportunity to be visible around what your status, maybe you might not share what exactly happened, but you give broad strokes, that it lets people know that you're there. But what I will say is that be prepared. If you are not prepared, then you may get triggered by the onslaught of people coming to share their testimonies with you. So when you put yourself out there, that I really wholeheartedly encourage you to either have peer support community, have resources that will keep you grounded, that will keep you grounded, because once you put yourself out there, then it's you create you're a magnet, a force, which I think is really powerful. But it's really important to take care and to know when to step back or take some time.
Thank you. Our next question is, how did you start the process? I mean, the very beginning of self-care in this work. I'm a therapist and have been working with survivors for 15 years, and I still have a hard time starting the process.
Thank you for that question. I started the process in 1992, October 1992, when I had my first appointment with my psychologist, and I didn't, let me say that when I went there, I wasn't going to talk about sexual violence. And I was, at that point, 92, I was raped in 89. I was molested from 79 to 81. So just to give that kind of time period in terms of seeing her. I had seen therapists when I was in college, but that was more kind of, I was told I needed to see one by the college because I was just not doing well. But 92 was when I really, I guess, moved in the direction of my self-care in that way. And so that began the process. But I would also say it was working in this, doing this work, that also played a role, because I was raped on a study abroad program. I'm not going to get into all the details at all, but what I will say was that I said yes, paid for a hotel room, and changed my mind. And was raped. And then, and as a result of that, I didn't think that I was raped. I just thought it was a bad experience because I said yes and I paid for the room. I didn't know that I could change my mind. I bring that up because it took being in the anti-sexual violence movement in the 90s and ongoing, but that really helped to raise my awareness around that. I was like, oh, I didn't know that this was not my fault. I didn't know that I could say no, even after I paid for a room and had my friends in college lie for me, at a time when, you know, there was no cell phone. I couldn't call. So once they lied, I couldn't go back. So that's where it started. It started in 92, and then start in terms of with therapy. And then in terms of working on my film No, which I started in 94, which then led me to get involved with the anti-sexual violence movement. I went to my first National Coalition Against Sexual Assault conference in 1995. It was in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. And so that was the work, working on No, connecting with survivor advocates, and therapy. And then in 2002 was when I took my first meditation course, Vipassana meditation course. And so it's been a gradual process. And healing work is ongoing. I'm a survivor of child sexual abuse. I would say I'm an incest survivor. That's what I would say. I'm an incest survivor, but I would go into my rape. I never talked about my CSA in any deep detail. And didn't start doing that work with my parents until 2010. And I was molested, as I said, in 79. So all that to say, in response to your question, is like, I feel like it's an ongoing process and journey. I'm 51 years old. That started at 10. I'm talking about 41 years, and I'm still on the journey. But I point to that first session with Dr. Whaley Perkins in 1992. But even before that, because when you said your first, I definitely saw a therapist, psychologist my freshman year in college. And I really credit her because in addition to my grandfather, I was molested by a family friend who was 11 years older than me. So I was 11, he was 23 or 22, whatever, it doesn't matter. He was in his early 20s. I was a tween, and I was told that I was flirting with him. And so I had embodied that message. And in therapy, I was just saying, yeah, I flirted with this guy. And my therapist was like, whoa, wait, let's stop. How old were you? And I said, whatever, I said 11. And she's like, how old was he? I was 12. I said 12. And I said, and she said, and I said 23. She's like, you were not flirting. You were a child. So that also, in terms of, in response to your question, when was that had to be 88, 89. Actually, it was before I was raped that therapy session happened. But it wasn't until 92 that I really started doing that work. And for me, I don't think I could have done it without do the work. I could not without therapy. There's no way. And now I'm really getting into body work. I was very resistant to body work, very resistant to it. And I think it's because I lived in my head. My head was my safe space. I just loved and took care of my brain. The body, because I was disconnected. It's evidence. I didn't want to do it. So I never wanted to do anything that required other than walking. Don't ask me to do any stretches, I don't want to be in my body. And now I'm beginning to re-enter consciously my body in that way. So in response to you're talking about the work that you've been doing for 15 years, I think it's ongoing. And each dot adds, it's like connecting the dots. I feel like I'll be a complete picture when it's time to go into the ancestral realm. I don't mean to be funny, but that's just really how I feel sometimes.
So our next question, as someone outside of the direct client service / support role, what do you think of self-disclosure between advocates and clients, particularly when clients are asking if something is normal, etc.?
And Matt, when you say client, are you in you kind of in a therapist role? Is that, I'm assuming, I'm gonna just ask, move in that way. Let me say, I don't, in terms of the person who I see, the psychologist who I've been seeing since 92. So whatever that is, 28 years. I have no idea if she's a survivor, none. And I'm okay with that. And so I'm just speaking personally, like I'm okay, because she specializes in trauma and has been able, so like when I've been like, is this normal, is that not normal, she's been able to respond. Now perhaps she's responding based on her lived experiences. She definitely shares it in under a context from a clinical psychologist perspective. So I'm not saying that she's a survivor, not that anything's wrong with her being a survivor. I'm saying that I don't know. With that shared, I think it can be a slippery slope, right? So how much do you share, to a point where, particularly unless you're in some kind of a peer friendship, you really do. I think it's important that you have a healthy boundary, not something where you're like the steel wall and you don't know anything, but where you don't know, where the survivor who needs support doesn't know anything about the person. Because it's not that I don't know about my therapist, I just don't know about their survivor status. I believe it's a case by case. That's what I think. And I know I have presented at sexual assault agency conferences, not recently, but years ago. And I was really chastised for talking about being a survivor. And I was actually appalled that I was being chastised around that in my, in the workshops or whatever. And yeah. So I think that I think there's a way in which, if you share, that you do it, that it takes it back to the person who is seeking support, so that it's not your story, that you're sharing anecdotal information that helps them. Will I get through this? Will I be still suffering? Will I always have flashbacks? That you can present it as information, but not where that person is in your, where they're caught up in your story. Or use examples. There are times when, rather than, so that to use examples that don't necessarily reference yourself. But overall, I'm not opposed to sharing one's status or lived experiences to help someone else. I'm not opposed to that, but I did just want to share my own reality in terms of my relationship with my therapist. I think that's really, it's just something, but I just think that just the kind of steel wall doesn't work. I mean, it may work. I don't think I think it's important that we all see each other as human and vulnerable and have experienced or known trauma. Because I think it's important for people to almost kind of see life after this, not life after I think you're always surviving, but another stage on the journey. I think that's really important, because I think that also plays a role in some of the kind of not wanting to talk about it, because there's so much shame, or I don't want people to think that I'm weak or I'm a victim or all of these real things. And so that for people to see you or other folks who are survivors, who have been victimized, but they are survivors, and they are survivors, not but. I think it is important.
All right, we have 2 more questions left and about 6 minutes.
All right, I'll be short with my answers.
How do we overcome the thought of what happened to me wasn't as bad as what has happened to other survivors? So how can I be an advocate for those who have been through worse things than I have?
I think that we have to I think it's important to move beyond this hierarchy of, well, using myself as an example, it was a date rape situation in a hotel. It wasn't a gang rape. It was in a different country. I never have to see that person again in my life. I haven't seen that person again, right? And so then it's like, well, maybe my rape wasn't as bad as that rape. And I think it's really important to recognize that trauma impacts our bodies. I mean, and definitely there's complex trauma, there's different layers of trauma, and to just not get into a hierarchy of trauma, just to honor what has happened and honor the impact that it has had on your life, and use those experiences not as part of your own healing journey, but also as in ways to support others. But I think it's really, it's not helpful to compare. It's really not, because we all, it's all horrible, all of it. Definitely, you know, there's a spectrum, but it's all horrible. And I think that it is important to honor what you've survived, what you are surviving, while you support others, and don't feel like, oh, it's what happened to me is not that bad. It is bad. It is bad. And what happened to this person who may have been gang raped by multiple people is horrible.
All right, so we are going to switch interpreters for the last 3 minutes. And our last question is, do you have a book/resource that you would recommend for someone who is beginning the journey to disassociate less and be back in their body? Deanna put in the chat, Body Keeps Score. So if you'd like to answer that as well before we close out the webinar.
Can you repeat the question again, just real quick? A name of a book that...
A book or resource that you would recommend for someone who is beginning the journey to dissociate less and be back in their body.
Not off the top of my head. I would recommend, there is a book that I find it very useful. It's called Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness, which really, and it's very trauma sensitive. Mindfulness. It's written by a white cis man who is very, it's a very culturally sensitive book. In fact, a third of his proceeds go to Black Lives Matter. Another third goes to generative somatics. Like, he's really much into healing, and it's called Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness. And I think it is a really, and it just came out like last year, maybe, powerful resource. There are other resources, but that's on my mind because I've been reading it a lot. But there are other resources that are, that I think that are also equally important, and I'd be more than willing to share them with NCCASA. I just need, you know, after this, and then they can share them out in maybe a follow-up email.
Thank you, everyone, for attending our webinar and for bearing with us as we figured out how to use ASL interpreters in our first webinar. Thank you, Aishah, so much for your wisdom and for being here today with us. Also, thank you, Kathleen and Tina, for being here as well. Thank you. So we are going to close out the webinar. If there are any questions that you guys continue to have, I am putting my email in the chat, and you are welcome to email me with any other questions, and we will get back to you with Aishah's answers. Thank you so much.